Today we're going to be taking a look at the Warhammer 40K Psychic phase, and looking at some of the tactics we can employ with our space wizards and witches. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we're going to be looking at the Warhammer 40k Psychic phase, which thankfully is a little bit less complicated and weird than previous editions, and I'm honestly quite a big fan of it, with wizards blasting mind bullets at each other or buffing up their allies with unnatural power. The mechanics of the phase are pretty simple, but I think they can create an interesting little mini-game within the game as the Psykers try and counter and outwit each other. So let's get started and take a look. So first of all, in your army list you need to decide whether you're going to be trying to bring any Psykers or have the option for any psychic defense. In this edition I don't think it's mandatory to have Psykers in your army list, indeed some factions can't, and I don't even necessarily think that you 100% need any psychic defense, and just put all your points and effort into just achieving your army's goals through normal methods. It is something that can be quite nice to include in the list though, if it doesn't hamstring you from taking other options, as dedicating a few points to it or having the option to buy stuff in with command points can be really handy in some matchups. When you're fielding Psykers, a lot of them might have the option to take mobility options such as jump packs for Space Marine Librarians or jet bikes for Eldar Farseers. Typically these are a very good idea in terms of points for the amount of utility that you get out of them. Other than spamming out powers all game, the main thing that the Psykers have to do is position themselves appropriately, whether that's staying out of harm's way or zipping in to try and get a close range power off on an enemy unit. So things like jump packs and jet bikes tend to be worth their weight in gold. In most competitive lists that I see, when people are taking Psykers, if they have the option to get additional mobility with one of these options, then it's typically taken. Of course that's just a general rule, it might be different for your individual army, but I think it's a good rule of thumb. Other than that, it's just literally buying in the Psykers for the utility that you can get out of their stat line and spells. It's worth thinking about any anti-Psyker options in your codex and how much they'd cost to include, whether that's in actual points or in opportunity costs, say taking relics and things. A few books have the option to buy in relics that have an anti-Psyker ability, for example options that can allow a character to deny a psychic power as if he were a Psyker. These can be really quite handy for if you do happen to be facing a lot of Psykers, and it's quite good because it means that you don't have to use them every game. You can see your opponent's list and then choose to buy in the relic with the stratagem. It's a bit similar for things like Assassins, where the Collectus Assassin is a powerful anti-Psyker tool. If you have gone through the Imperial route of keeping an Assassin in reserve for 2 command points and allowing you to choose which one, then that can be another decent counter-Psyker strategy. Obviously this does have an opportunity cost, so it is going to be worth it whether or not that's worth it to build into your list, compared with just spending those points and command points elsewhere in more men and guns for example. Again, in most games you don't necessarily have to declare your psychic powers on the army list, though a lot of players do choose to do so. There's nothing to stop you seeing your opponent's army list and then choosing psychic powers that you think are most going to help you in that matchup, and that will generally give you more flexibility and better allow you to tailor to any given game. For example, if I was an Eldar player playing Imperial Knights, then Doom and Jinx would be pretty good money, as they really let you focus down one big threat each turn, but if I was playing an army that had loads of multiple small units, then they're not going to be anywhere near as good. The Psychic phase really depends heavily on your movement phase, as it's going to be the positioning of the Psykers that allows them to either get in range or get out of range of psychic denial. You have to think about this a little bit when you're deploying them on the board. Typically with my Psykers I'll typically try and deploy them fairly far forward in the deployment zone, but somewhere that's pretty safe behind enough of my units that I don't think that the opponent will be able to shoot them directly. Most Psykers are going to want to be moving up to get within either 18 or 24 inch range of the enemy to cast certain psychic powers on them, so you basically need to weigh up trying to get them there compared with keeping them safe. In the movement phase, provided you're not wanting to either shoot or charge, then don't forget you can advance and still cast psychic powers. A lot of people automatically don't do this because advancing stops you from shooting, but there is no such rule for psychic powers, so you can advance and cast just fine. This really can make a lot of difference, particularly if you're just a few inches out from getting a power off on an opponent, or just keeping them back and getting them out of trouble. The other major thing for positioning of Psykers is to try and get out of the way of any denial or anti-psychic abilities that your opponent has. Every movement phase there's absolutely nothing to stop you from asking where your opponent's Psykers are, and you definitely should do that, and then you can absolutely pre-measure 24 inches away from them, and put your Psyker just outside that denial range, because if they can still cast their psychic power fine from there, then you'd just be silly to give your opponent a free attempt for a denial if there's no difference made otherwise. This is the reason why I find a lot of the anti-psychic aura abilities just a little bit weak and underpowered against a skilled opponent. Unless your Psyker absolutely has to be throwing themselves forward to the front of the lines, then there's no reason you can't just drop back and cast. Say with the Colexus, his aura of -2 to cast is only an 18-inch circle, so unless your Psyker needs to be on the front line, he can often get easily out of that just by moving and advancing and still cast happily. When you do come to actually cast your powers, it's worth bearing in mind the different warp charges and how likely they are to go off. I've included a few of the most common here. Warp charge 5 will usually go off, warp charge 6 to 72%, warp charge 7 is getting a bit risky with only a 58% chance to cast, and when you get into warp charge 8 there's really no guarantee it's going to go off unless you have other abilities. This is also the sort of progression you get for Smite. Smite starts very easy to cast with an 83% chance, then drops to 72 and 58, just meaning that you're getting less and less value out of attempting to cast Smite with each successive Psyker. There is one slight positive of having higher warp charge powers to cast though. The ones that are warp charge 6 or 7 will generally be harder to dispel on average than warp charge 4 or 5 spells. The thing is with warp charge 4 and 5 spells is that you might cast them on that very low number, say a 4 and a 5, then an opponent will find it trivially easy to deny that. So against armies with lots of denial, the low warp charge powers might not necessarily cast quite as reliably as you think, because they might just get denied when they're cast on their low numbers. Presuming that we do have Psykers that are within either casting or denial range of each other. If you're casting the powers, then you want to think about trying to get your most important powers that are vital to your game plan off each turn. Usually that might mean saving them till last, meaning that you might be able to bait the denials out with a few less important powers, and try and distract your opponent from saving their denials from the last one. If you are casting a really important psychic power, and you cast it on a low number, say it's a warp charge 5 power and you cast it on a 5, it can definitely be sometimes worth it to reroll one of the dice with a command reroll to try and make it significantly harder to deny. Say you passed it on a 4 and a 1, you could re-roll that 1, maybe get a 5 or something, then it's going to be a lot harder to deny that power. Obviously the utility of that depends on how vital it is to your game plan. If you're denying enemy psychic powers, then the main thing you need to know is what psychic powers each Psyker has access to, who's casting, and try and make a decision as to which psychic powers you're going to try and throw those denials at, and which you can afford to let through. Having said that, you do get the advantage of having more information than the caster. You get to see what they've rolled before you decide to deny it or not. So say they've cast quite a good power, but they've rolled an 11 for it. It might be a bit of a waste to try and deny it, because you're only going to be able to do that 1 in 36 times, and if they've still got other powers to cast, then you might well be able to deny them on far lower results. In a similar vein, if they do cast a mediumly useful psychic power earlier in the phase, you might have been trying to save your denial dice for a really powerful one, but if they cast it on a really low number, then it might be worth it just to go for that one instead, as you're pretty much certain to deny them a moderately good psychic power, compared with saving it for the last one, as you don't know whether they're even going to successfully cast it, and if they do they might cast it so high that you're very unlikely to deny. Again, for denying psychic powers, this can be one of the most efficient ways to spend command rerolls. Say if you do roll just under the value that you needed, and one of those dice that you rolled was a 1 or 2, then essentially you can turn it into a very high chance of you denying that just by rerolling that dice. Even if you only have one Psyker to deny a power with, then the power of just having that one deny and the option to use a command reroll with it can give you a really surprisingly good chance of getting that one important deny off. For this reason, I think that if you are buying in Psykers for denial purposes mainly, then the first one that you include in your army has greater value than subsequent ones after that. We haven't talked about Perils so far, but it's certainly worth bearing in mind. If you roll a double 1 or double 6 when casting, then it does mean that you will suffer D3 mortal wounds on the Psyker. This is bad, but it's even worse if your Psyker happens to have 3 wounds or less, as it gives them the chance of dying and then making a mortal wound explosion, which could be far worse, and they could fling mortal wounds all over half your army if you're unlucky. In general, it is a very low chance of going off, but you can try and mitigate it through command rerolls if it's absolutely essential that you don't peril, and it's often worth keeping a command point safe if you are planning on casting a power with a Psyker with 3 or less wounds. Probably the biggest advice I can give you with Perils of the Warp is to really think, do you actually need this psychic power, and will it have any actual impact on the game? I myself, and I've seen other people, certainly cast psychic powers just to randomly apply a silly buff to a unit that's never actually going to take effect, whether it's just like giving +1 attack to a unit that's a long way behind the battle line, or giving -1 to hit to a unit the opponent was never going to shoot anyway. Most of the time it doesn't really matter, and it's absolutely fine, but if you roll a Perils then you'll feel very stupid for trying to cast a psychic power. and then doing nothing to hinder your opponent, but only harming yourself. The most spectacular example I've had of messing this up was when I cast a Psychic Barrier spell on an infantry squad with an Astropath. He Perils, I had no command points left. The Astropath went on to take 3 mortal wounds and die, meaning he exploded, killing an Imperial Knight on a wound or 2 left just next door who was just about to fire. A Perils in the wrong moment can be incredibly painful. Though sometimes, but not regularly, it can be best to leave your Psyker not casting for a turn if it's not going to make any difference. It's worth bearing in mind some of the psychic abilities that your opponents will be having. Obviously there's a whole load of different abilities that can either help you cast or deny out there, but some of the most common are Space Marine Psychic Hoods, having +1 to deny when you're within 12 inches of Librarians there. Imperial Guard can get ridiculously cheap Astropaths, which can mean that they can have a fair few denials going round for a very tiny points investment. Sisters of Battle have Shield of Faith, which means they can have a small deny on 1d6, meaning they can have a very small chance of denying any low warp charge powers if you roll low for it. That's any unit in their whole army. We already mentioned the Collector's Assassin. He's got an 18-inch aura of -2 to cast for Psykers, and he can be brought in as a counter assassin by that stratagem. Tyranids have Shadow in the Warp for -1 to cast within 18 inches. Orcs have War Energy, which is a casting bonus for up to +3 to cast depending on how many boys are around them, but it does make them a bit more likely to Perils. Necrons have a couple of anti-Psyker options, but Gloom Prisms on Canoptic Spiders are a very cheap way to get more denies in the army, though it does mean that you have to commit to the Canoptic Spider in the first place. The Genestealer Cult Magus, as well as being a Psyker themselves, can make nearby Genestealer Cult units resistant to psychic powers, and they'll be able to deny them themselves if you target them with powers when they're within 6 inches of the Magus. Grey Knights have +1 to cast and deny just for being them. Thousand Suns have a couple of really good special characters, many rules that buff their psychic phase, not least Long Range Smite and Smite that doesn't get worse with casting. But watch out for the +1 to cast and deny for Ahriman and Magnus can even be +2 to cast and deny if he's still on full health. Finally, quite a lot of armies have a stratagem that can deny a psychic power on the roll of a 4+ when they're within 24 inches of any unit from that army. Examples of this are Black Templars, Iron Hands, Sisters of Battle, and Adeptus Mechanicus Graia. I wouldn't be surprised there are others as well, but these ones are really important to know that your opponent has, as being able to have a 50-50 chance of just saying nope to any one psychic power is really good, particularly if it was a power that you were really depending on, perhaps something like Warp Time, Doom Jinx, or Quicken for Eldar, something like that. So that's a brief overview of the psychic phase and some of the general strategies that you can use to try and maximise it. If there are any other tricks or tips that you think that you'd want other people to know, please let us all know down in the comments below, particularly if there's any faction specific from your faction that you think other players should know about. I'll be continuing with regular 40k videos every day, so if you'd like to hear more from Auspex Tactics, feel free to subscribe. And if you are watching regularly and enjoying the content, any support on Patreon is greatly appreciated. I can only focus this much time on making videos through the support of my patrons on Patreon, as making all of these videos does take quite a lot of time. If you would like to support future video creation, then the link is down in the description below. There's also a few other benefits, such as voting on which videos come next, and seeing some new videos early. A massive thank you to my current Patreons for making all this possible. But in any case, thank you very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.